Good evening, Lansing School District, staff, and families. Thank you guys very much for joining us for this session of Parent University. My name is Kyron Harvell, and I'm the director of the STAR grant. STAR stands for School Transformation Accelerates Results. This evening, we are very fortunate to have our special education director, Mrs. Harmony Costello, who will talk about IEPs and 504 plans and what is the difference. Again, thank you guys very much for joining us. Please feel free to enter any questions to the chat. You may also enter your questions into the Q&A box, and we will respond to all questions, or she will respond, because she's the expert, to all questions upon conclusion of her presentation. Ms. Costello, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming this evening and to be learning about the difference between 504 plans and IEPs. At this point in time, I'm going to share my screen here. And I'm just gonna, there we go, get our slideshow started here. All right, so I hope everyone can see that all right. So we will start this evening off with Section 504 plans and individualized education programs, also known as IEPs. So our objectives for this evening are to talk about the 504 plans and the IEPs. What is a Section 504 plan? We're going to go over that in detail so that you have an idea of what goes into a 504 plan, how do students become eligible, what is an IEP, and what are some of the components of both of those plans. And then also, who do I contact if I have questions once we are finished here, or if you are sharing this information with other families, how to get answers to your questions as we go along. All right. So what I did is I put these two side by side so that you can see how some parts are the same in a 504 plan and how some parts are different. And so as we walk through this together tonight, you will be able to see exactly how those are the same or different. So I start right out with who can request an evaluation. If you have a concern about a student and you're not sure whether they need a 504 plan or a special education evaluation, anyone can request an evaluation, but the parent or guardian must give consent for that evaluation. So how do I go about requesting an evaluation? The simplest method is to contact your classroom teacher or the school administrator or the special education office. And I will have that contact information at the end of our presentation this evening. So when we talk about 504 plans and IEPs, there are different laws that govern each of these plans. And so in talking about them, which law? In 504 plans, we talk about this through the Americans with Disabilities Act. The regulations that implement this act fall under the Enforcement Division of the Office of Civil Rights. In terms of IEPs, which are under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, these regulations are enforced through state government and the federal government and also the courts. So two different places, two different laws, and two different enforcement mechanisms, okay? So when we start to think about eligibility in a 504 plan, the standards are very broad. There are a number of things that can qualify you for a 504 plan as well as for an IEP. But in the 504 plan, we are looking for someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And on the next slide, I'll give you some examples of what those activities might look like. In terms of an IEP, there are very specific standards in Michigan, and there are 13 categories or areas that you can become eligible in. And in addition to those categories, Michigan also sets out the fact that the student must need specialized instruction. So that's another area that is a little bit different than a 504 plan. So in a 504 plan, some examples of major life activities are caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, or breathing. And there are additional categories as well, but these are just some examples of the areas in which a 504 plan might be appropriate. So if a student had a problem with hearing, and they didn't necessarily need specialized instruction to be able to take advantage of instruction in the classroom, but they might need some interventions, then we could put those in place through accommodations or some other options in the classroom to take care of that. In terms of an IEP, there are 13 categories, and each one of these categories has a very specific list of criteria that must be met in order to qualify a student as having a disability or needing an IEP to help with their instruction in their classroom. Okay, so you can see here we are talking about a cognitive impairment. So that would be an impairment in their mental functioning. A hearing impairment, this includes deafness. A speech or language impairment. Oh, and I just see that I have that twice. I apologize for that. I'll have to get that other one in there. A visual impairment, which also includes blindness. A serious emotional disturbance, which in most states is called emotional disturbance, but Michigan is called an emotional impairment. So that's one thing that we do a little differently than the rest of the country. Then there is an orthopedic impairment, or what we call a physical impairment. So some of these terms are different federally than they are in the state of Michigan. Then there is autism spectrum disorder. And again, I put speech and language in here. I'll have to get that replaced. I apologize for that. Traumatic brain injury. These are things that we might see in a number of different ways. Probably the most common thing that you might think of with a traumatic brain injury would be an automobile accident, and a student ends up with a traumatic brain injury as a result of an automobile accident or a serious fall. Other health impairment, typically things that fall into other health impairment are things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or things like asthma. There's a whole list of conditions that would qualify a student for eligibility for an IEP under other health impairment. Then there's a thing called a specific learning disability. And this is where we most often see students with medical diagnosis of dyslexia come into play. We, in the educational arena, we do not evaluate students for dyslexia. What we do evaluate for is a specific learning disability in the area of reading, broad reading, or reading fluency. And so these are the three areas that might come into play if a student has a medical diagnosis of dyslexia. And so that would be what we would evaluate for there. The student also might have a specific learning disability in the area of writing or some of the areas in mathematics. So those are other areas in which a student could have what we call a specific learning disability. Then we have deaf blindness, or sometimes students have multiple disabilities that are together cause them to have impairments to the degree that they would need special programming for those multiple types of disabilities. Okay. So in looking at what a 504 plan is, so we just talked about how students become eligible and the areas in which they can become eligible. We want to talk a little bit about what a 504 plan is and what an IEP is and the differences between the two of them. So when we look at the definition of a 504 plan, it's an impairment that is a disability within the meaning of the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, if it substantially limits the ability of the individual to perform a major life activity as compared to most people in the general population. So let's say, for instance, you have a hearing impairment and you need an accommodation of a different kind of phone, a phone that would give you extra sound, or a phone that might go into a hearing aid, or a phone that might display captions. Those are all accommodations that could be part of a 504 plan for a student who had a hearing impairment. And the student may or may not need the additional services in an IEP. So the 504 plan in that case would be sufficient for that child to be in the learning environment and to be able to access the curriculum. So when we talk again about the impairment under the 504 plan, it does not need to prevent or significantly or severely restrict the individual from performing a major life activity in order to be considered substantially limiting. So the example that I gave about the hearing, that particular example would not be significant enough that it would limit that person's ability to perform their job or to perform the activities in a classroom. So though they are eligible under that major life activity, they can still go on about their daily activities with this intervention or an accommodation to be able to help them to access what they need to learn. And then also, not every impairment will constitute a disability. So you could have a hearing impairment, but it might not be significant enough that it would be considered a disability under 504 or the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the decision about whether an impairment substantially limits a major life activity for a particular student should be made on an individualized basis, which is something that brings us to the IEP. So the definition of an IEP starts with a student with a disability, and that means a person who's been evaluated according to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, and the rule, and these rules, and those rules are talking about the Michigan Administrative Rules for Special Education. And it's determined by an individualized education program team, or an IEP team, of which the parent is a very critical member of that team. An individualized family service plan team, so an IFSP, and those are for the little ones, our youngest learners that are from 0 to age 3. So the IFSP would be also, that team would determine whether the student has a disability, or an administrative law judge could also determine that the student had one or more of the impairments that are specified in that particular part of the law that needs special education or related services, or both, and who is not more than 25 years of age as of September 1 of the school year of enrollment. I'm going to stop there for just a second and mention to you that the federal mandate, and we'll see this again later on in the presentation, but the federal mandate for special education is age 3 to 21. However, in Michigan, the Michigan Mandatory Special Education Act came before the federal IDEA, and so these rules and this criteria was laid out prior to the IDEA, and as a result, Michigan is a 0 or a birth to age 26 state, and I think that there are about 3 of those states left where we serve students from birth through age 26, okay? So the student who does reach the age of 26 years old after September 1st is a student with a disability and is still entitled to continue a special education program or service until the end of that particular school year. So it really gives our students a lot of support for transitioning into adulthood and into programs after our typical high school type of education. So then in the law, it also states that a multidisciplinary evaluation team makes a recommendation regarding eligibility to the IEP team. So you might be thinking, okay, what is a multidisciplinary evaluation team? That's a really big lot of words for an acronym, yet another acronym that we use in education and in special education in particular, called a MET. And basically what this is a team of individuals who have specific professional expertise to evaluate students as to whether they have a cognitive impairment, as to whether they have autism, as to whether they have a hearing impairment, whatever the issues around that specific student are, they will assess that student based on the information that's provided by the teachers and the parent, and then conduct that evaluation and make a recommendation to the IEP team as to whether the student should be eligible as a student with an IEP. Okay, so that's basically what the 2 types of plans are and the differences between them. So the 504 plan is very broad. It has more life type things that fall into the eligibility areas, whereas the IEP are specific to a particular category of disability. So that's the difference between the 2 in terms of the definition of those. So next up is our evaluation processes. So the processes here are similar, but they're different. So there's a similar type of process to a special education evaluation in that we look at professional evaluation reports and we make recommendations based on those reports. But we also reevaluate students on a periodic basis as opposed to a required annual basis and a required 3-year reevaluation basis. In terms of the 504 plan, we may need verification from a medical doctor, especially if it's something along the areas of a hearing impairment, a type of physical impairment. There may need to be a recommendation from a physician as to what the student is able to do or is not able to do in the learning environment. So that is something that is very much a part of the 504 plan process. Parent input is also part of the process, and it's in the 504 plan. It's not a required part of the process, But in terms of our district, we like to have our parents involved in these types of processes because the parent sees a completely different side to the student at home and knows what has happened prior to them coming to school and after school and on the weekends and all of the things that they do and they are involved in. And so that parent input is very important to us understanding as education leaders. It's very important for us to understand the parents' input and the reasons that they feel the student might need a 504 plan. In terms of the IEP evaluation process, in Michigan, the evaluation must be completed in 30 school days. Now, that's about 45 calendar days. So it's a little bit different. When you're talking about a 504 plan, it's roughly the same time frame, but because it's not, because the requirements are a little broader, a lot of times the 504 plan can have happen quicker. The evaluation process can happen quicker. And sometimes just having all of that medical documentation ahead of time really moves that process forward. So for an IEP, however, the timeline begins upon the receipt of parental consent. So what we have to do in that evaluation process is we do something called a review of existing evaluation data. And we gather data about the student from the parent and the teachers and all of the individuals that are connected to the student. And we gather all of that information and present that to the parent so that the parent can make an informed decision about whether that evaluation should take place or whether it should not take place, or if there's something missing that we need to include. And so that parent input, again, is very, very important in the process, and it is also a required part of the process. So once we evaluate a student and they become eligible in special education, the reevaluation has to take place at least every 3 years. And this is because students' needs change. The student isn't going to be the same student in year 1 as they will be in year 4 after those 3 years have gone by. So we need to reassess and make sure that the student does still have a disability, and to also determine what the educational needs of the student might be. So that has to take place every 3 years, and that is mandated. It's required. Again, in this evaluation process, we may need verification from a medical doctor. And so it's very helpful if parents have that available or it can get that information for us so that we can assist them in the evaluation process. Okay, so this is the evaluation process. We are going to be moving on to the plan itself and what is actually contained into each of the types of plans. So you're going to see here that the 504 plan is much shorter, and there are just a few components in that part of the plan. In an IEP, however, there are a number of components, and I'm going to go through those so that you have a general idea of what needs to take place or what should be taking place in an IEP team meeting if you are going through going through that process. So in a 504 plan, basically what happens is you are identifying and describing the student's needs as to the limitations for the life activities and a need and how that affects the student in the learning environment, and then what accommodations they might need. So does the student need really just extra time on tests? Or does the student need a separate testing area? These are examples of accommodations that the student might have on their 504 plan, or maybe they have a health plan. So these are things that can be part of a 504 plan. Also, any interventions that might work for the student. Maybe it's a check-in, check-out. Maybe it's, you know, a specific type of academic intervention or behavioral interventions. Those are also acceptable types of interventions. And then all of this plan is for the general education curriculum. So it's solely in the general education curriculum. This does not cross over into the IEP arena. Now, there are students who do have a 504 plan for specific needs, generally medical or health related, and also have an IEP. But those situations are very much individually determined, and they usually, they happen very rarely. So if we have a student with a 504 plan and an IEP, that would be completely based on the student's unique educational needs, and it does not happen often. So when you get to an IEP, I'm going to just walk through here and tell you basically how an IEP should be run. First of all, the first thing that happens in an IEP is you introduce the IEP team members and learn what each individual's role is for that IEP team meeting. So from parents to occupational therapists, psychologists, resource teachers, program teachers, whatever the role is of the individuals at the table, there should be an introduction of them and their role in the IEP. And this is the agenda template that we follow in the Lansing School District. Also, on the IEP itself, we would review the purpose of the meeting, and we review this agenda, including all of the items that are listed here. So then participants would sign in to the meeting or give electronic signature approval. There are specific participants that are required to be at every single IEP team meeting. And so we want to make sure that we have documentation of those individuals at each meeting. And so the easiest way for us to do that is to sign in as a participant. And so as long as I'm talking about this for a moment, I'm going to mention that the only time an IEP needs to be signed, and it's not actually the IEP that needs to be signed, it would be the consent for the implementation of the very first IEP, the initial IEP. There's sort of a myth that goes around that talks about parents have to sign the IEP. No, parents do not have to sign the IEP because it's the district's offer of a free, appropriate public education. And I think what happens sometimes is that when we sign in as participants, it feels like we're signing an IEP. So just know that you're signing in just as a participant. You're not necessarily agreeing to all the contents of the IEP. Okay. Then we would go through and we would talk about what the student's eligibility for special education is. And so again, those 13 categories from Michigan are what we would be looking at. We might be reviewing that. Sometimes students have more than one disability area that they are eligible for. And so the IEP team might be deciding which eligibility area would best describe the student's needs. And so that is something that can be discussed when we discuss the eligibility area for special education. You might also sometimes hear people say the student is certified in a particular area of special education or certification Those are things that are said quite often about eligibility. And so those are some terms that you can now be familiar with. We talk about the students' strengths and the needs, and these are very important things. Students all have their own strengths, and we want to make sure that we pull out the most positive aspects of the student so that we can work on those strengths and use them to our advantage in the educational environment. So that, say for instance, a student is really good in math, maybe that student could also help a classroom buddy in math because they're really good at it, and that would give them some confidence and a way to make a friend in the classroom. We also look at students' needs, and most often the students' needs are based off of the evaluations that are taking place or off of classroom assessments or observations in the classroom. And so any need that is identified in an IEP must be met in some form or fashion in an IEP, whether that's through an annual goal, whether that's through an accommodation, maybe it's through a service, but every identified need must be met and addressed in the IEP for the student. And so here we come to the parent concerns again. This is an area I alluded to earlier that parents are a very, very important part of the IEP team because the IEP basically serves as a communication vehicle between parents and the school district. And whenever possible, we definitely want to come together and in consensus around a student and around their IEP. However, if for some reason that cannot occur, ultimately it is the district's responsibility to provide the parent with what we call an offer of a free appropriate public education, or a FAPE. And then the parent has the right to either accept that offer of a FAPE or to challenge that offer of a FAPE. And there are specific avenues for doing so, but hopefully we could resolve those issues before we would need to seek any kind of outside assistance, because we want to work together with our parents and our families to make sure that our students are successful. So then the next area are the most recent evaluation results. So in this section might be the testing results from the evaluation itself, if this is an initial or the first IEP for a student. We might have those testing results in there. We might also have some outside testing results. There might be a report from a doctor or from a therapist or from an ABA therapist. There could be all kinds of different types of evaluation results. And it's the district's obligation to consider each one of these evaluation results and determine whether this is something that needs to be part of the student's IEP, or if it's really just for our background information and knowledge, but it must be considered. The next section would be the student's needs identified. Oh, I said that from the most recent evaluation results. Sorry, repeated there too. And then special factors. There are some special factors that must be considered. Positive behavior supports and interventions are one. Whether the student is an English language learner is another. There are, I believe, about 6 of them that we must consider. And so as part of that IEP team process, we would need to go through those. Communication for the student, whether the student needed Braille. So you get, I think you get the idea about the types of factors that would need to be considered in that process. So again, the 504 plan is fairly brief as compared to the IEP process. So this is the last part of the IEP process, and this is sort of the big meat of it. The present level of academic achievement and functional performance. This is the huge, huge part of the IEP that gives us all of the information, well, most all of the information, that we are going to need to be able to develop the rest of the IEP. So again, I go back to the needs of the student resulting from the disability. We talked about student needs earlier and how they need to be met in some form or fashion in the IEP. So we are looking at things like, are there academic concerns? Are there behavioral concerns? Or are does the student need to work on functional life skills? So these are the kinds of things that are encapsulated in that present level of academic achievement and functional performance. And sometimes you will hear people refer to it as the PLAFP. It's that just long acronym, so PLAFP. So once we have that, the present level of the IEP developed, then we look at what kind of goals and objectives the student is going to work on for the next year. And the IEP is good for a full year, a full calendar year, 365 days. So we want to talk about what kind of goals and objectives we are going to work on, and they must be measurable. So they need to incorporate enough detail that everyone on the IEP team knows what the student is going to be working on, how they will be assessed, and then how progress will be reported to the parent periodically. So those are the components in the annual goals and objectives. And there's more to that as all of this, but I want to just give you kind of the basics in that area. Supplementary aids and services. So these are the accommodations and the other types of services provided by what we call related service providers, by a school social worker, an occupational therapist, a physical therapist, a speech and language therapist, a resource program, and that will come later in the program section. But these are all the things that we combine in that section when we talk about supplementary aids and services. So basically the accommodations and what services the child is going to be receiving. Then there's a section on assessments, and these are state and district-wide assessments. There are some assessments, as many of you know, that are required every year at different grade levels. And so the M-STEP is one of the assessments. If a student needs to take an alternate assessment, like the My Access assessment, this would also be filled in this section. In terms of transition is a part of the IEP that is required when the student turns 16 years old. They start working on not only the curriculum or whatever their goals and objectives are, but they start working on things that will happen after they are away from the school, after they have graduated, after they have transitioned onto, and these involve basic life skills. They involve post-secondary education. Do I want to go to does the student want to go to a community college? What type of job do we want to have? All of these kinds of things are contained in this transition section so that we know exactly where the student wants to go and what their career goals are. Next is transportation, and this is one of the areas that is something that not a lot of students need, because this is what we call specialized transportation. So these would be students typically that might be wheelchair users, maybe young students that might need a 5-point harness to be able to ride the bus, students that may have difficulty getting to and from the bus, a regular bus pickup site. So those are based again on the student's unique educational needs, and that would be determined by the student's IEP team. Extended school year. So extended school year is an area that is misunderstood in many areas. And I want you to have a good understanding of what it is and what it is not. So extended school year is not summer school. Extended school year is an opportunity for students who may regress on their goals and objectives or need additional assistance because of regression. And there are some specific criteria that a student must meet in order to qualify for extended school year. And every student is eligible for extended school year. And this part of the IEP must be considered for every student. But it would be a specialized type of instruction during the summer months. But again, it is not summer school. So it gets a little confusing, but hopefully I've mentioned this in a way that will help you understand exactly what it is and what it's not. So then there's a section called Other Considerations. And this section is really for anything else that sort of doesn't fall into all of these other areas. A section where you may need to think about anticipating some things that might be coming throughout the school year. Maybe information about a field trip that could be coming up. And I know that's hard during COVID because that's not happening. But in the brick and mortar setting, we would look at possibly field trips, perhaps extracurricular activities like sports, some accommodations or some specific considerations around sports in this area. Anything, again, that does not fall within that specific category in the IEP. And then the last section, which is really almost the most important section of the IEP, is called prior written notice. And these are all the things that the district and the IEP team have discussed during the IEP and have decided they're not going to put into place. So let's say, for instance, we have a particular kind of therapy that we're going to discuss, and we decide that we're not going to implement that. The discussion of that particular therapy would go into the prior written notice as something that we would not be implementing. And so that information must be provided to the parent prior to the implementation of the IEP. That's why it's called prior written notice, because we do this, give the parent the information prior to the implementation of the IEP. So now moving on into the next phase of an IEP or a 504 plan, this is the implementation phase. And this is where in a 504 plan and also in an IEP, the plan must be implemented in all settings for the student. It cannot not be implemented. It has to be implemented in all settings for the student in the way that the document is developed. In terms of the IEP, periodic reports of progress must be sent to the parent or guardian. And this typically takes place around the regular marking periods when students are receiving their general education report cards. The IEP report cards, essentially, also called progress reports, must be sent then to the parent or guardian at that same time. So in terms of implementation of an IEP, if you have questions or concerns regarding your child's IEP, the best place to start is to contact your child's teacher, because that teacher has the ability to quickly make the change for your child and has the ability to make sure that the things that are concerning you can be addressed as soon as possible. So again, in going over the Section 504 and the IEP, there are many areas here that are similar. There are many more areas in an IEP that must be implemented and must be developed to a greater detail. Each one of the plans are also based on the student's unique educational needs. So looking at a 504 plan from one child to another, the plans should not be the same. The times in the services should not be the same, because this is an individualized plan for each individual student. So I just want to go back again and talk about the fact that a 504 plan is very broad, the IEP is very detailed, and I think that we covered all the main areas of the differences and the similarities between the two. So at this point in time, I would say to you, if you have questions, to please call the Special Education Department at 755-4000, and we will get your question answered either through our administrative assistant. She may route you to one of our supervisors or to myself, depending on what information you need and the school that your child is in. So if you do call our office, it is very helpful for us to know your child's school. So at this point in time, I would be happy to take any questions that might be lingering out there for folks. And I will stop sharing my screen.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Costello, for that very informative presentation. Let me take a look. Are there any questions? I'm looking here in the chat box. So, well, I have a question. If parents have concerns, would it be best for them to start off by recommending that their child have a 504 prior to being tested for special ed, or what would your recommendation be?
So this all depends on the student and on the situation. So it depends on what the student's needs are and what is happening with the student. So again, if we go back to kind of the areas for a 504, those are those broad areas of the daily, sort of the daily living skills that are really impacting the student. So let's say they have asthma, and it really is impacting them in the classroom, and they just simply need to be able to go to the school nurse for like an inhaler, to access their inhaler at several points during the daytime. That might not be a reason to have an IEP. That might be a reason more to have a 504 plan, because it's not really impacting their, it's impacting their education, but it's not necessarily impacting their academics or a behavioral concern. It's simply a matter of they need to go and they need to get the inhaler and then come back.
Makes sense. Okay. 504, who takes part in developing the 504? Who's all at the table when this occurs?
So in a 504 plan, it can be the principal, the parent, and perhaps a teacher, but it can be done, it can be as small as the team needs to be or as large as the team needs to be. So it depends on the issues with the child in particular. So let's say, for instance, a student has a bad fall and they have a broken leg, and they just need a 504 plan for a short period of time. They can get a 504 plan for that. So they might need to involve the school nurse. They might want the principal there, the classroom teacher, and anybody else that might want to support that student while they have the broken leg, because they're going to need to, maybe they can't necessarily get around on crutches. They may be using a wheelchair to get around. And so they're going to need some assistance in making sure that they can adequately get themselves around the building and those types of things. So it could be a small team or a large team, depending on what is needed.
Great. We have a question from the participants. We
Okay.
have an appointment in late March to go over these plans with the special education department. I've tried to reach out a few times to find out about rescheduling, but have not heard back. Any suggestions on a specific person I should reach out to? Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question. And if you would call our office in the morning and speak with my administrative assistant, Roxanne Rogers, she will direct you to the appropriate supervisor for the school your child is in, and we can get that taken care of. I know we have a lot of students, from the spring that we weren't able to bring in, to have evaluations or to have things reviewed and revised. And so we have some other plans in place at this point in time. So please let us know. Contact our office there at 755-4000, area code 517, and we will get you taken care of.
Thank you. Also include the information in the chat. Nurse Hoff also mentioned that school nurses are very happy to be a part of the 504 IEP process as well. So that's information. Let's see, are there any more questions? Well, again, thank you very much, Director Costello. We really appreciate this presentation and your knowledge and expertise on a topic that is very important. I've been administrator for years. I still have some questions regarding the differences. So this was great for me as well. Thank you to all the participants, and I look forward to seeing you guys for our next Parent University session. Everyone, have a good evening. Thank you for supporting the district. Ms. Costello, any final words?
No, just don't let if your child is struggling, be proactive, reach out to the school, talk to the classroom teacher. If you're not getting the answers that you need, then talk to the school administrator and so forth. So we want your children to be successful, and we want them to do as well as we can and be superstars in our Lansing School District. So please let us know how we can help.
Sounds great. Thank you again, Ms. Costello, for a fabulous presentation. And everyone have a good evening. Wait a minute, we may have one more question. I said thank you. Okay, we're all set. Have a great evening. Take care.
You're welcome. Thank you.